This question was sent via the Cult of Cornette Facebook group by Christopher D'Onofrio. Jim, during his WWF run, Mr. Perfect was one of the most gifted workers in the company, but he always seemed stuck in the upper mid-card instead of breaking through as a top champion. From your perspective as a booker and a manager, why do you think Vince McMahon never pulled the trigger on pushing Curt Hennig to that next level? And do you think realistically he could have carried the WWF title in that era?
Ooh, last question first. Curt was, as they said, probably the best worker in the ring. His shit was, flawless, and he had a style all his own, and he was so effortless and natural. But I don't know, because think of how few champions Vince had from the time the Hogan era started until the time that the Attitude Era, they were winning it on Monday and losing it on Friday. You know what I'm saying? Just constantly switching belts. I don't know that Curt had the Randy Savage look or the Hulk Hogan look or the Ultimate Warrior look that Vince wanted. I think that Curt would have probably, had the NWA progressed in the latter half of the 80s as it was in the last half of the 70s and the first part of the 80s, Curt would have been a fine NWA champion. I don't see him as a WWF champion because of what Vince was doing at that period of time and who he was featuring, how few people he was featuring, and that most of them had to be a dominant babyface. Curt, and as an AWA champion, Curt was the only good thing about the last few years of that company. But it was a different philosophy about who to put the belt on. It was the guy to have the best match with a variety of people, like a lot of times the NWA was, and who could draw money and who could, take the schedule. But with Vince, it was a whole different thing. And Curt was not, I don't want to say Randy Savage was a cartoon character, but he looked like some kind of goddamn celebrity. Curt was more just a great pro wrestler. You see what I'm saying? Am I rambling here?
No, and I think, he did get a good push in 1990. They gave him a run with Hogan. He wasn't the guy to take the belt off Hogan, but he got to work with Hogan. That still says a lot about what Vince McMahon thought of him. He got the Intercontinental title and Bobby Heenan after that. You only do that to someone in 1990 that you had plans for.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't that everybody respected from Vince, all the boys in the ring. Everybody respected how good Curt was. I think it just, it's almost unfair to say, well, why didn't he make him champion? He didn't make almost anybody else champion either.
But in 92, he makes Bret champion. And in 91, Bret beat Curt or Mr. Perfect at the time, for the Intercontinental title at SummerSlam. And that's the last time he wrestled for almost a year and a half. He became Ric Flair's Bobby Davis because Bobby Heenan didn't want to go on the road.
And by the way, that was one of Bobby Eaton's favorite matches. When I went over to his house one day in Charlotte, he had that SummerSlam match with Bret and Hennig on, watch this, these guys are great. And they were, it was.
But, even though he was around and he was on TV and at times he was a commentator, he was on Primetime Wrestling, again, with Ric Flair. But as like Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels are finally, Bret first, obviously, but getting their chance as singles to get a push, Vince has to change things because of the steroid controversy. Hogan's gone. It makes you wonder how different things could have been in that few-year period between SummerSlam 91 and the end of 92. If he hadn't gotten hurt, if he had been an active wrestler, that may have been the window. Like to kind of build it up and set it up right there, because it happened for Bret right after that.
Yeah, and the back problems, were what his downfall was. But there you go. So have you noticed that everybody that was a great worker or performer in the day, they eventually, but then they blew their so-and-so when the big chance might have finally gotten there.
Well, when you got there in 93, he had returned. And he was working with Shawn Michaels that summer, had some really good matches. And then he was gone. And then he came back when you were on the booking committee, right? 96, 90, I think it was 96.
Yes. Yes.
What was the story there? Did Vince ever, like, what were Vince's plans, or how did Vince see him at that point, years after this early part we're talking about?
God, I'm thinking he was one of the guys with the Lloyds of London insurance deal, right?
At one point, yeah. At least
because
one point.
that was the thing, is there was a similar thing going on with Rick Rude at one point, with Animal of the Road Warriors, who
everyone from Minnesota,
all these guys, all the Minnesota guys had got the Lloyds of London policies, and Animals was somehow settled that he was injured where he could never have a single match again. But if he had tag matches, it was okay. They wouldn't ask for their money back. And so every once in a while, you'd try to book him in a single match to set something up for a house show or a pay-per-view. No, I can't do a single. And I'm trying to remember at that period of time in 96, but I think the idea was that, Kurt has so much to offer, but even if he's injured, he can still be a personality of some description, as they tried him, in different capacities, manager, commentator, whatever. And it just, I think at that point, like with Rude, a lot of those guys, they were handing out bigger checks and more checks in WCW for guys who had a name but couldn't wrestle, but we'll find something for you to do. And that's why a lot of those guys gravitated down south at that point.
But of course, when he did, he couldn't use the name Mr. Perfect. He had to go back to being Curt Hennig.
But everybody kind of knew,